Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. I'm very pleased to be here as one of the co-leads of Work Package 2 that was really set up to design these models that would provide innovation while supporting stewardship or sustainable use and access. So I've worked very closely with the full Work Package 2 team under the leadership of Christine Ardel, who we heard from yesterday from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, Francesco Ciabuski, Professor of International Business at Uppsala, and myself, and really a very mixed and talented team on Work Package 2. So, as you know, this project is made up of academics, of policymakers, and of the FPA partners, the pharmaceutical partners, and that's brought tremendous depth and strength to the project, and it's really unique the way we've been able to work as a group together, bringing all those different talents into one room many times, and for really robust discussions. As an ex-boss of mine once said, if I've got two people in a team who agree on everything, I don't need one of them. So everybody in WP2 was needed. So we had plenty of good discussions to get to where we've got to. It's been a very interesting journey over 3 years. The journey isn't over yet. Hopefully this is the start of the journey of making AMR a threat that we can really address as part of the outputs of Drive AB. So let me take you through the different models and how they support three different principles of Drive AB, of innovation, stimulating innovation. We heard from Ursula this morning about some definitions of innovation. Sustainable use, ensuring the longevity of antibiotics for continued patient benefit field as possible. So this is a quick summary of what Christine told us yesterday. The difference, or the group of incentives that we have been discussing, both the push incentives that work in the pipeline, providing resources to push antibiotics through the development pipeline, and the pull incentives, the market entry rewards, or other types of financial incentives placed for the time that a product gets approved and beyond, so the reward to pull products through the pipeline. Now, you can see there's 4 different mechanisms proposed here, but these are not really choices. This is like an ecosystem of solutions that can be provided. They all play an important role in stimulating antibacterial R&D and refilling that pipeline that currently is too thin. And Ursula gave us a very nice presentation on the need for push incentives, but let's not forget that pull incentives are absolutely essential, because without a pull incentive you have no market, you have no private capital going into the R&D organizations. And really the whole thing will continue to fail. So it really is a balance of support needed both throughout the discovery and the pipeline, and then into the market as well. And I'm sure that there'll be very few developers involved in this area if the market continues to be broken, as we say, and does not deliver an attractive return on investment for developers in this space. I won't go through the detail of this because I think Christine covered it very well yesterday, but very quickly, the grants are obviously early phase research and leading on beyond that. The pipeline coordinator is a terminology used within Drive AB to really coordinate the priorities, where to place the funding across the pipeline to ensure that you do get a broad diversity of products coming through, and we've seen very good examples of that being developed recently through CARB-X, through BARDA, and GARD-P. So building on that really robust foundation to coordinate efforts in the pipeline and deliver that variety of antibacterials. And then we get onto the market entry rewards, really to deal with the most pressing public health needs. So focused market entry rewards, and I'll come onto the detail of that shortly, so I won't explain that here. And then the continuity model to ensure supply, and we've heard quite a bit about the problems of supply, definitely post-IP, but supply of low volume products is an issue for any manufacturer. So there needs to be a mechanism to ensure that happens, again, which helps to protect the longevity of these products available to patients. So, market entry rewards, and hopefully many of you have had the opportunity to see the poster outside that was put together by Matt Renwick from the LSE, Silas Holland from MSD, and myself, also with input from the the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. And really that highlights some very key points. What do you need from a market entry reward? Well, it certainly needs to be targeted towards public health priorities. One of the really complex areas is funding. So it's not just the amount of funding required, but also the sustainability of that funding. As we know, developing antibiotics can be a 10 to 20-year process. So it's no good if this market entry reward scheme is set up for 5 years and then funding runs out. It has to have longevity if it's going to effectively incentivize long-term investment in this important therapy area. It needs to be transparent, so all the people involved in it, whether it be payers or developers, know what the criteria are to gain a market entry reward. They need to be publicly available, and it really does need to be target product profile driven. So the reason that's important is because that's the way of focusing on health priorities through those target product profiles. And those need to be developed externally through multi-stakeholder groups, including public health, epidemiology, developers, because the pharmaceutical developers are very aware of what can and cannot be achieved in target product profiles. And when I've been designing those, my colleagues in product development, in R&D, have been the first ones to say, hold on, that's not possible. So it has to have that element, well, it's not just an element of reality, it has to be firmly grounded in reality. So that's really going to be a multi-stakeholder approach to develop those target product profiles, which will then be the focus of the development activities. And traditionally, that tends to have been done, certainly for pharma companies, as an internal exercise based on their interpretation of what unmet needs may be in years to come. But it's I believe, a much more robust model if that target product profile is designed externally based on global unmet need involving all those different stakeholders in order to drive that R&D process. It must be sufficient. So the market entry reward needs to be of a sufficient amount in order to attract players to stay in this market and attract new investment into the market as well. And it's a two-pronged approach. So it's a return on investment approach. And remember, if you're a multinational pharmaceutical company, you have choices where you put your investments. Oncology, as we know, is a very popular area right now. And as we heard from Chris Henschel this morning, every different therapy area has rationale as to why they're special and need investment. And that occurs within companies as well as within health technology assessment organizations. So companies have choices, and so we need to make it an attractive choice to invest in antibacterial R&D. But of course, you also need to have, in addition to this, which was in the poster, it needs to be cost effective. So the public payer needs to know that they're getting value for money when they put the MER up and are willing to pay that for a specific target product profile. So it needs to meet those individual and societal value criteria that Chris again highlighted this morning, and Ramanan as well, of course, through diversity, enablement, societal value, and those other parameters that often aren't considered when assessing the value of an antibacterial today. So it does definitely need that cost-effective element, including in its benefit that it brings to society. So let me just quickly take you through the models that we've discussed. This is not a comprehensive review of every type of model discussed, but it points to the key types of market entry reward, which is a mechanism that delinks revenues from volume sold. And so that's the fundamental aspect of the market entry reward and the delinked model. This is what we call the fully delinked market entry reward, and in this instance, all the revenues come from that market entry reward. So there are no additional revenue streams. It's a single source of revenue. And that revenue may be split up across a number of different countries, but it's essentially totally delinked from any volume of product used. Now, the upside of this is that provides a very de-risked revenue stream. anybody who qualifies for the MER knows they're going to get that revenue stream over those years, dependent on a few criteria. For example, if the product showed up some problems after a year or so and had to be withdrawn, obviously that would entail the MER ceasing. But outside of those abnormalities, it would be a guaranteed risk-free return on the investment. The downside, potentially from an investor opportunity, is that this can be seen as a sales cap or a revenue cap, so there isn't in effect any potential for growth in revenue beyond what's stated in the MER. You can see beyond the time period of the MER, there is also a continued, what we call warm manufacturing payments, to ensure that the company involved, not only through the contractual elements in the MER, but also to cover the costs of manufacturing through to the end of the IP period. So the second model that we had extensive discussions about was a partially delinked MER, and this, as you can see here, has two different components to it. So you've got the standard delinked payments. Again, this is spread over a 5-year period. We chose to spread the delinked payments over a period of time rather than have a single payment at registration, because that was considered to be very high risk for the payer. They may pay out, for example, $1 billion market entry reward, and then they carry the risk of the product all the way through after that. So it was considered much more favorable to have a spread of market entry rewards, which also keeps the company involved as well for potential product development activities, different indications, different formulations, etc., which may enhance its patient acceptability. So the market entry reward in this instance is also supported by sales revenues or revenues from other streams. The advantage of that is for the payer of the market entry reward, that can be potentially substantially less. Of course, there's a risk that if resistance rises unpredictably, the revenues outside of the market entry reward may increase significantly and the payer may end up paying more. But if that doesn't happen, there's a potential benefit that the payer may pay less. So there's an added risk element to this that isn't there in the market entry, in the fully delinked market entry reward. But that risk can fall either towards the payer or the developer. You'll also see here that we had, as with the fully delinked model, a pre-qualification period at the end of phase 1. We initially thought about the end of phase 2, but one of our meetings with our SME colleagues, they highlighted the end of phase 1 will be a much more useful time to start that pre-qualification phase. And basically, if at that time you're getting an indication that the TPP has a potential to be met, and I know it's very difficult at the end of phase 1 to make any robust statements like that, but if it's heading in the right direction, you could enter a pre-qualification phase, which you can align or liken to the QIDP status of the GAIN Act in the US, although this will be very much bound around the specific TPP being developed and hopefully being met. And then at the end of phase 2, that will be revised again. And the reason that's attractive is because with that external due diligence going on that molecule to grant it that level of pre-qualification comes an assurance for external investors that may well be on track to receive an MER, so there's more likely to free up some private capital coming into that company with that designation, so that they can continue the development. The third model is what we call the sales-adjusted model. This is really like a subsidy based on what revenues would be received from a traditional market approach. So there is still a MER element, but that's simply to make up to a set limit of sales. So it's a sort of slight hybrid between the two. Now, what we're not doing here is necessarily recommending one model, one type of MER, because that's going to differ according to the type of molecule being incentivized, the prevalence of any specific resistance, and a variety of different pathogens. Also, the willingness to pay and the type of infrastructure involved in delivering the MER. So there's a lot of different risk elements to take into account here, purely financial elements, and the desire of the payer to keep the company involved in the product post-launch and any activities therein. So, just moving on from what the basic model looks like to how does this support sustainable use? Well, there's definite agreement across the board that sustainable use measures are a great thing to have. They're essential and they should be contractually built in to delivery of the MER. So that's from a developer perspective, but also from a country perspective. Sustainable use measures need to be built into countries who are receiving the antibiotic that's going to address their areas of resistance to ensure that that molecule will have as much sustainability in those specific countries as possible. We've talked today about infection control measures and other types of sustainable use activities that could be implemented at a country basis to ensure that that happens. And we're recommending it's a special working group under the guidance of potentially the EU Commission, G20 or TAPFAR, be set up to develop these standard use measures, both for governments and for developers. I mentioned earlier on that we had a very broad group of people in Work Package 2, and that, of course, led to different opinions. So here I'm highlighting two different opinions as regard to sustainable use measures for developers. On the left-hand side, what we call the sort of pragmatic recommendation, which came from a number of different elements within Work Package 2, and then a much more stringent recommendation. I'm saying more stringent because that really takes a lot of control away from the companies involved in developing the medicine. They have very little control post market approval of the antibiotic, whereas the pragmatic recommendation is much more the company stays involved. And we're seeing a number of initiatives going on in that space at the moment through the Davos Declaration of over 100 companies coming together in January 2016, which they highlighted a range of activities that they wanted to take forward in order to drive sustainable use. And then that was followed up by the IFPMA roadmap, and now that's being implemented through the AMR Industry Alliance. So some very active industry-driven activities to try and drive sustainable use. And of course, those have to be married up with external activities as well. So again, I think as Pierre Mullen highlighted yesterday, what they're looking for from Drive AB is a selection of policy, potential policy initiatives. And so here are some different alternatives from which decisions can be made and the best option for that particular molecule can be made. And I keep on going back to the specifics because I think when you're dealing with MERs with large sums of money, those have to be negotiated on a molecule-by-molecule basis from a framework of available options. And so these are some of those available options. Options for country sustainable use measures, and I'll move through this quickly, but actively implement its national AMR action plan. And then for each MER recipient, potentially through the WHO or some other organization, develop antibiotic-specific policy guidance, comply with the antibiotic guidance document within the countries, and also report any adverse events and resistance levels that may be occurring, and then meet a minimum threshold for public finance in the healthcare sector. Now, these are very broad guidances, and it could be that, you know, if countries are moving towards this, then that would be a step which would trigger the availability. But of course, it's not down to the industry to decide on individual countries' healthcare measures. That's a public health and an overall governance objective to which the industry would align behind. So, building an equitable availability. So our recommendation is to have equitable availability measures for developers, and these should be contractually linked with market entry awards and also long-term continuity awards, so keeping products available post-IP. And a special working group should be convened potentially under the Global Antibiotic Resistance Partnership to develop standard equitable availability measures. And building in that equitable availability to ensure access in as many countries as possible. So companies would submit an access plan as part of the pre-requirement to get a market entry reward. Countries that were not included in that access plan, for whatever reason, may then request to be included in the plan so that they would get access to that antibiotic when it's available. The company would then work with, for example, the World Health Organization to develop an antibiotic-specific guidance policy for that antibiotic. Because remember, when an antibiotic comes to market, the people who know most about that are really the people who have developed that antibiotic. So they're in a very good position to support any organisation going forward on guidance. And also the company commits to monitoring activities within that specific country, and that can include availability of data, surveillance, and many other activities that would be agreed with the governance body. So just going back to Christine's slide yesterday, this again shows the menu of different incentives. As I said before, this is an ecosystem. These should not be looked at in isolation. They all have to work together in order to build a robust pipeline. And they're all important components. Take one or two of these away and the system will not function. We've talked about a broken global market for antibacterials, and really it does take a complex menu of measures to effectively fix that market. So remembering Drive AB's principles, hopefully I've been able to briefly cover what we need to do to drive innovation, to really get companies and other investors back into this space to help fill that pipeline and bring through effective antibacterials against antimicrobial resistance. It needs to be sustainable. We need to get the maximum longevity out of those valuable antibacterial assets, and we need to increase access to countries and individuals who don't currently have access to that. But of course, that always goes with the access versus excess. We don't want to drive excess use and inappropriate use. It has to be appropriate and effectively control that access.